Welcome, everyone. This is Heidi Hayes Jacobs, and I'm thrilled to invite you to join me in an interview and discussion with one of the most well-regarded colleagues I have in the field, and someone who I have known for decades, and that is Karin Hess. I'm so happy you're with us, Karin. For years, you have worked so deliberately on deepening learning, on the notion of making cognitive rigor accessible and understandable. I think you've been an interpreter of models that influence us, like DOK or Bloom's taxonomy, and so good at making those connections. Your work on progressions of learning versus more kind of almost big swaths of this is good, this is pretty good, this is excellent, but really deliberately looking at what it looks like from a student's point of view, have revolutionized learning. And I honestly believe you will be and will continue to be a pillar in the new directions of how we're trying to make our work accessible to students, but more meaningful. Karin has a new book out. We're going to talk about the book for a moment and what that's about. But Karin, I just want to welcome you and just I'm so delighted you're spending time with us.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here. I was excited to have this conversation. I was just reminding Heidi that we first met back in the late 1980s. And I watched a workshop she was doing in Newark, New Jersey on discussion strategies. And she threw a volleyball into the crowd and said, "That's a question. Now answer it and throw it back to me." And she did that a couple of times. She said, "Who touched the ball the most?" And everybody kind of looked at each other and said, "The teacher." Then she threw out multiple balls and she said, "Simulate a discussion." So we both come from a place of student-centered learning, and we're kind of still promoting those ideas in a variety of ways. So this is exciting to be here.
Oh, thank you for reminding me of the volleyball. I don't have one right now, but I'm definitely tossing it to you. Karin, you have a new book out with Teachers College Press. I believe it's coming out in days or very shortly, maybe
February, probably after the first year, probably in February.
All right, very good. It's called Applying Depth of Knowledge and Cognitive Rigor, an Educator's Guide to Supporting Deeper Learning, which is a phrase we hear a lot. Could you tell us a thumbnail of the book and its focus?
Sure. I was asked to write the book because depth of knowledge comes up so often, but there's so much misinformation out there. So I had sort of three goals. The first is to clarify what depth of knowledge and cognitive rigor are. And so there's a little history behind my work with it. The second is to talk about the importance of transfer, learning transfer. The late, great Grant Wiggins used to say, transfer is playing the game. And so often kids come to practice every day, but we don't let them play the game. So there's a module about how important learning transfer is and how to get there. And then there are practical tools for designing instruction and designing assessment, looking at student work. And because I've always believed that if it's practical, teachers will pick it up and try it. If it's only theoretical, they'll say, "That sounds like a great idea, but I don't have time for that." So that was really my purpose, but that there's a research base, and that's the other thing that's important. A lot of people are familiar that I have a rigor matrix, but it's based in research. And I think people are more willing to try things when they know that it will work. It will work with young children. It will work with high school kids and everyone in between.
Yeah, I think a couple things pop up for me that I'd love to hear you go a little further with. One of them is you've included the phrase deeper learning. Mm-hmm. And as we know, there's models and discussions about deeper learning generated from Hattie or Michael Fullan and others. Yeah. In the context of what you're talking about, how are you portraying that in the book? In other words, what does that start to look like when you apply your model? How do we know we're going deeper? What starts to emerge?
Great. That's a great question. I hope I can be brief enough. I sort of have I had this idea that came to me when I was looking at other models that I've been familiar with and that Hattie of course, has talked about. The solo model is one of the models he talks a lot about. And I came up with some visuals. So the idea that if you had a couple of markers and you made some random dots, that's sort of where we start asking kids to memorize things. That's depth of knowledge 1. And those dots are not connected. Then we can focus in on one dot. Let's make it a little bit bigger and let's draw an arrow from that dot to the other dots. Now we're starting to make connections. Making connections is the next level of getting deeper. And so that's when we ask kids to explain their thinking, explain the connection, to look at cause and effect or compare and contrast. So now we're at a depth of knowledge 2. Moving to depth of knowledge 3, the arrows are going in both directions and the little circles are getting bigger. So we're expanding knowledge. We're constructing knowledge. As the learners are now constructing knowledge. There's been a shift from teacher-directed to student-directed learning because they're asking questions and all of those little circles are enlarging. And now we get to depth of knowledge 4 and the circles start to overlap. So the blue and the yellow make a green because there's new insights. So the idea is that deep learning has to allow students to make connections, to explore possibilities, to expand their thinking, even if it's not always correct, even if there's not one right answer, it's what invites students into the learning opportunities. And so the descriptions that I use in my matrix, you can really see the shift. There's no way you can talk about students constructing a mathematical argument or collecting data and supporting their conclusions if they're not in some control of that learning.
That was beautifully said. I think one thing as I'm listening that maybe others have seen it right away, that I'm seeing it more clearly now is if I'm an educator, there's a lot of models out there and good ones.
Yeah.
And James Webb's work on depth of knowledge has been around a long time. We've all seen in workshops really good models of like an iceberg, and you look at the tip of the iceberg and then you look at how it goes deep. The phrases deeper learning have come out and are used in a lot of different ways. What you've done, from my point of view, is the very thing you're talking about. You've shown the connections between these. Plus, you've leveraged in Bloom's taxonomy. And why has it been with it so long? Because it's a good model. It's a model that people can make sense of and see it applied. But it's also, any of these can be treated almost, unfortunately, a little too superficially unless we look at how those connections are made. So what I see is that you've applied this concept of cognitive rigor in your own application. And I think that's pretty exciting.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, all of those models, like you say, I even start out by saying, as a classroom teacher, I was using a lot of different models. Bloom seemed to be so easy. You could just pick a level, pick a verb, voila. Kids were maybe thinking deeply. But my conclusion was that I've stuck with depth of knowledge. I call it the MVP of thinking models, because the M being it's meaningful enough to be able to say, this is a recall question. This is a problem solving question. So I can connect it. It's valid. It's been validated. My rigor matrices have been used in many research studies. They've been validated. So it's supported by research. But the P is of the MVP, it's practical. I can look at an example and say, I could do that. I could ask a question differently and get a different result. And that's what I like about that model over maybe all the other ones that I've explored. And I read them all. I study them all.
You do. It's interesting you say that. I've always felt, because I'm a curricular person, I'm a curriculum person. And of course, that means you also have to be an assessment person because you're looking at curriculum and demonstrations of learning. I always found that Webb was the one that immediately was almost saying, okay, when you go deeper, what will it look like? How do you shape and pose a series of curricular essential questions? Or how do you make decisions about how you're going to weave in your unit to take students beyond just background information and memorization and go into owning it, giving voice, because I think that last level is a lot of student voice. It's how they're making these connections and insights, as you've said. So I'm in agreement on that. And it's probably one reason I'm drawn to your work. I have a question about your audience for the work, because I think your description is apt, and I think the listeners can get a sense of what your book is about, and it's beautifully laid out, and it is practical as well. But who were your target audiences when TC approached you, or did that change?
It definitely changed because they produce a lot of books that are used in college courses, pre-service, in-service,
Yep.
graduate courses. They said depth of knowledge comes up all the time, but nobody's really clarified what it is. And they said a lot of instructors maybe aren't even sure. And with good reason, because there's a lot of misinformation out there. As a matter of fact, I devote one module to the 7 common misconceptions. One being, it's not about how quickly you learn or how old you are, how tall you are to go on the ride. It's how we frame the learning. So that was the impetus. But as I was working, I said, well, I work with schools where I've maybe spent time with them 1 year. 2 years later, they say we have a lot of new teachers. We need to introduce these ideas to them. Do you have a good article or a good something? And I've shared a lot of videos that I've worked on. And actually, I've incorporated all those videos into the book now. So you could see me leading an activity. But I think the audience is those people out there who are new to depth of knowledge, new because there's a pre-service or a pre-service or a new teacher, or people who just never heard of it before. I remember doing a workshop and about 10 minutes in, somebody raised his hand and said, what does DOK stand for? And that's when I had to remember that I've been reading about it, thinking about it for a long time, but not everybody has. But it's also for those school leaders and instructional coaches. They are the people who often contact me and say, I'd like to use your matrix. Do you have any suggestions of how I can introduce it? And so that to me is, I don't want to go to every school. I don't need to go to every school. I just need to support all those great instructional coaches out there who can take a good idea and run with it and make it their own. And that's where I have these little scenarios throughout the book of people who have shared with me how they introduce it in many different ways, some that I hadn't even thought of. But it just goes to show that those school leaders and those instructional coaches are key to having a shared understanding. Just like actually with the storyboarding, it's when you're kind of as a staff, you're deciding how are we going to teach this stuff? What are we going to focus on? And that's important. That collaboration, whether you have formal PLCs or grade level teams, it's a way to have the conversation.
Let me just amplify something you've said here. Having read the book, and I was delighted to write an endorsement of the book. It is
Thank
super.
you.
Yeah, but I really thought you're onto something. It's unusually accessible and good to go for any professional developer, anybody running a PLC, even a group of teachers who informally want to take a look at this. It's ready to go to put into action because you've organized it, the anecdotes or scenarios you reference, but also those modules. And so I think you've really achieved the thing you were after. You mentioned storyboarding and passing, and I was about to get into a little bit of a few questions in relationship to the work Allison and I have been working on streamlining and storyboarding. And as you know, we are very much focused on curriculum, the design, the choice making involved in curriculum. And you've known this about me for a long time, that I feel curriculum is a composition. Curriculum is not a purchase program. That's a purchase program that can inform curriculum. The curriculum actually was designed for specific students and how they're going to spend their time in real settings. And there's such an array of possibilities. But one thing we've written about a lot, as you know, is that it's jam-packed. There's too much.
Yeah.
That you can't just keep adding new knowledge, which we have to because knowledge keeps growing, and not take something off the plate or consolidate it. And so my first question, and I wanted to ask you, is about streamlining, and the second will be storyboarding. So let's start with the streamlining question.
Great.
Do you see a relationship between streamlining, that is the process of formally making choices about what to cut back, consolidate, create, and deeper learning with cognitive rigor? In other words, if you have an admonition, if you have an aspiration for cognitive rigor, do you see a necessity to streamline the curriculum? That's my question for you.
Well, the simple answer is absolutely. There was a study, a Pew Research study that came out earlier this year that said 84% of teachers who were surveyed said they felt they were stretched too thin.
That's right.
And I think part of that is because we keep adding things. Here's another thing you have to teach. And sometimes they just feel overwhelmed. I felt a little that way when I was a teacher. I saw it in the teachers I worked with when I was a curriculum director and a principal. And I think teachers as individuals always have to make choices. So I made choices. Well, I know I'm not going to cover all these chapters in the science book. Which ones will I cover? They're going to do that anyway. So if you're doing it collectively as a collaborative act, then you're talking about what is important to teach. I know during COVID, a lot of people said, we're just trying to get through the basics. I think that's part of the reason kids lost ground, to be honest, because everybody was making decisions about what they wouldn't teach.
That's right.
And what they wouldn't give feedback on. So part of this idea of streamlining is saying, I still remember a principal saying to us one time when I was a teacher, he said, if there's going to be a fire drill and you know you're going to lose half of the class time, what is it you will teach in this lesson? And I thought that was streamlining on a micro scale. Like, what is most important to teach? So having the conversation about what's important to teach, what's most important to teach. A lot of people have written about priority standards. That's a starting point. But even with priority standards, you still have to decide, what are my learning targets? And will those learning targets take students from teacher-directed activities to student-generated questions and ideas and activities? And that's what depth of knowledge does. I talk a little bit about near transfer is when kids do something exactly the way they were taught. I teach you how to decode words. I teach you how to add or subtract. And then I check to see if you can do that. That's near transfer. Far transfer is I teach you how to decode words or add and subtract. And now you're in a new situation, a problem-solving situation. And you're using those skills in an unfamiliar setting. And you're feeling kind of proud that you were able to do that, as opposed to, yeah, I learned it, I memorized it, I can do it, it's way too easy.
That's absolutely right. I think the key too, maybe just another angle on what you just described from a curricular vantage point, is phenomena-based learning doesn't have any word like discipline in it. It's not interdisciplinary. Interdisciplinary is discipline. You're looking for connections between a lot of really good material you want to make sure students are engaged in. Phenomena-based is emergent. It's in the real world. It's even beyond education. It's an authentic setting and situation. And that is exactly right, that you are playing the game. There's no constraints that were designed, or it's not a contrivance. Maybe a useful contrivance in the classroom to do simulations. This isn't a simulation. And, ultimately, that's where you want deeper learning to take you. So you feel more equipped. Even if you don't get a really satisfying solution, you at least begin to know how to grapple with it.
Yeah.
And it is.
Let me just
please
emphasize something you just said, because it's putting it in the real world. That's what pushes it like that to the deeper levels of thinking, the deeper knowledge of thinking. And that's what streamlining says. We have to teach some basics. We have to build a foundation. But why, when kids say, why are we learning this? What I love is that to be able to say, well, this is how you would use it in the real world. Right. This is how a real scientist would solve this problem or work on this problem.
I love that. I think that's right. And I see that my colleague Allison here is making some good comments here. And it's about partnering with learners and making them self-directed. Thanks, Allison.
Yeah.
I also noted that Kyle Haver was happy to see us together. Kyle, I always love to see your name pop up any place. So thank you for that.
Me too. Me too. I worked a lot with Kyle in
Me
New York
too.
City school. So
anybody who's ever worked with Kyle with New York City knows that he changes your perspective on everything. It's just great. Let me just throw out one thing. I don't want to lose sight of this thread you just raised, and then I want to definitely get into storyboarding. And that is streamlining isn't just cutting back, and it's something you just sort of got at. It's making it better. In our book, we referenced Dreyfus, an engineer in the last century, early part of the last century, who came up with the term, and it wasn't to just cut back. It was to make a product or deliverable more desirable, more effective, and more pleasing. It's like, a streamlined car looks good. A streamlined process in a business isn't just you've cut things out. You go like, gosh, things run better and it feels better. And so the curriculum is similarly, it's not just a hatchet. It's sort of looking at some of those priorities. It's okay. Is that your dog?
it is my dog. I have to open my office door and get him out of here.
Well,
Oh, this is my other one.
Everybody is happy. Okay, go do your thing.
Okay, talk a little bit more. I'll be back in 2 seconds.
I'll be right back. Okay, she'll be right back. Let me just elaborate on that. And one of the things that Allison and I thought was really important was the formal streamlining review. It needs to be conducted. So as Karin beautifully pointed out, you're setting priorities, but you're also making decisions in light of who your specific students are, that you have a relatively short amount of time and you're making them collaboratively. We really like the idea of looking at reviews vertically. So it can be, it could be grades 4 through 8. It could be certainly K-12 or K through 3. And even as you lay out your decisions across the year, you're looking at what's going on in other subjects too. So you can avoid redundancies and other ways of working. So the streamlining process, we think, works very nicely with a lot of Karin's ideas about the notion of cognitive rigor, and that can be an axiom for carrying it out. I think that there was a note or a comment. I'm trying to see if that can pop up again. I'm looking at, there was one in the chat. Yes, Kyle. Yes, in the most effective learning-centered schools, students learn how to learn and apply their learning, and the embodied curriculum can be the structure and scaffold for students to climb on their own. I think that's absolutely right. What I'm going to do is ask Karin. Oh, good timing. I was just going to say, I was going to ask you, so now I will ask you the next question. And as we're going to come to conclusion in just a few moments here. But I did want to ask you about storyboarding, because you reference storyboarding in your book, and we view storyboarding on several levels, where curriculum now is written as narrative, and in a very real way, the teacher is a creative writer. It's a composition rather than unit silos, where I might have designed it really well. It might even be deep. Karin, could be deep.
Absolutely. I did that too.
I will own that a big part of my curriculum mapping career, I wish I could do over. I mean, I think this is one of the big lessons learned, and I'm not joking about this. So we're very much oriented towards that, but we were particularly aware of how obtuse and difficult many templates are. And we've designed some of those too, and that they're not student facing. And if students don't see the connection of the story of algebra across the year, or the story of earth science for a 3rd grade science class, then in fact, it's going to be highly problematic, and they won't really have a sense of those connections. So we like the visual nature of it. We like the areas we've worked on, but we were delighted to see you reference it in your book. Would you just share with our listeners here why you chose it and why it resonated for you?
Sure. Not only did I reference it, but Allison put me in touch with Christina Fulton, who developed an example that I put in the book. I read your book.
Thank you.
And I said, wow, this is different. And I was a curriculum director for quite a few years, like I say, and it's tedious work and you want to get it right, but it still feels kind of overwhelming. You can't share it with a parent. You certainly can't share it with students. And what I saw in the storyboarding was, number one, it's about learner-centered pedagogy. And that's that shift to DOK3 and DOK4, is when the learner is contributing ideas and directing some of that learning. So you see a picture. Now, my older son was a very bright kid, but boy, he was a rebel kid. If he had seen a picture of a skateboard and thought, that's how I'm going to learn about kinetic energy through skateboarding, which is something I love. So what I saw in these examples was, first, the visual that kind of grabs your attention. Kids are very visual. Then there was a great, and I'm going to share just the first unit in the example in the book. The first unit is conserve or splurge. Mm-hmm. There's a picture of a dripping faucet. So yes. Now you're curious. There's a question. Where are we wasting water? Wow, we hear about that. We hear about that in the news. It's so real world. And then there's a little description. We're going to use what we learned in 6th grade about unit rate. So we're bringing in the prior knowledge, and we're going to solve some problems about where there is water being wasted. Okay, that's real world. So this is about, we hear about student agency, personalization, but that's very abstract. This is a very concrete, simple way to invite the learners in. And then there are learning targets. And so I worked with Christina to identify what are the DOK levels of those different learning targets. And there's a message there. That's not all about, I'm going to plot. Let me just read. I'm going to plot the relationships on a graph, DOK1. I'm also going to explain in context of a problem what those mean. Now I'm at DOK2. And then there is a problem-solving activity in each of these units where I'm going to take this information and solve a problem and develop a mathematical argument, because these are math units. What it comes down to is, I can't ask a teacher to stop teaching about proportional reasoning and unit rates. I have to get that teacher's mind around, when would you ever use this in the real world? And that's the beauty of these. I could stand up in front of parents and say, this is what we're going to be learning about this year. And they'd say, wow, that's really interesting. That's interesting how you actually connected it to real world. Mm-hmm. So that to me was huge, because it is learner-centered. It is about engagement. It is about going deeper. And see, that's the other piece. If we storyboarded, but we never got to any deeper learning, we'd be sort of doing the same old thing we have been doing. We've been allowing some kids to go beyond if they were smart enough to do it on their own, and we wouldn't be expecting it of all students. So this is an equity issue. I
loved that. I am so glad this is being recorded.
Me too, because I probably couldn't say it again.
Oh gosh, that was needed. You know, one of the things that you mentioned that Allison and I have been seeing, and Christina, who does work with us, and Ben Akalik, who works with us too on services to schools and organizations. Mm-hmm. One of the things that we've noticed that's really interesting, that you said, you inferred it, but I want to elevate it a little bit. You were very direct about how in this particular storyboard, we're very big on the titling and the genre. The nature of the genre is going to be more problem solving than just topical. It's engaging. You talked about the images, which need to be vivid and absolutely reflect the essence of what's in the storyboard. When you talked about the focus of the story, which is the descriptor across, one thing you noted was that Christina really emphasized, you're going to be actually using this knowledge and these mathematical applications in these real and very timely kind of ways. Here's the thing that I think that we found, and that is, when you very consciously, because your curriculum writing approach shifts dramatically when the audience isn't just, as you've done many years, filling out a template, you're putting in your map, you've got, it's sort of bureaucratic, you drop down your official stuff, you describe your swab that students will be able to.
Mm-hmm.
You aren't really thinking in the same way as the creative writer who's going, who is my audience? I got to write this for them. Would they want to do this thing? And so what starts to happen, you start to go, oh my gosh, this is just a coverage unit. This is so boring. Whereas you go, it brings out your better angels, curriculum writing angels, as you go, I want to make it more engaging. So I thank you for your referencing our work. Allison and I both were very humbled by that and grateful for it.
Oh, I'm elevating your work. I'm not just referencing it. I'm elevating.
Thank you. Oh, that's right. That's the title of your book. He's elevating. Thank you. Karin, I just wanted to give you the last word here. Well, I'm going to do the final last word, which is thank you. But the pre-final, I just want to know if you had any thoughts about or wonderings or what this last book has made you think about moving forward in your next area of research or curiosity. What's on your mind? What has getting to you about this work?
Well, I always struggle with, is it more important to bring everybody into the vision, or is it more important to provide practical models? And I listened to Tom Guskey had a podcast a few months ago. And what he was saying is, it's hard for some people to really believe all kids can learn. It's hard for some people to believe that there is this thing, equity in the classroom. But if you started to change practice, if you started to do something a little bit differently, that's when the shift happens. So I believe the more examples and models you can provide, because we haven't seen these things before. We didn't experience them as learners. Mm-mm. But if I can say, here's how you might design a performance-based assessment. And I have this little STARS template. S means, what's a situation in the real world? What's a task you want kids to do? Who's their audience? What resources you're going to give them? And what are they learning now, the success criteria that they can apply in this real world situation? That's so simplistic. It took me a long time to get to that point. But when teachers see a model, there's a shift. There's a shift, not just intellectually, but in practice that gets sustained over time. So I hope with all the work I do that the models, they'll evolve. I expect them to evolve. But the models will be the starting point for people to say, oh, I could do that.
Well, we look forward to your continuing to elevate us and keep following your journey and your path. I think I speak for everyone who has viewed this and will, that you are a gift and a wonderful human being as well. And Karin, thanks for giving us a little of your time. And I recommend the book, which will be coming out with Teachers College Press, and wish you all success. Thank you so much.
Yeah. And I just want to thank those people who've been making those great comments all along, Barbara and Kyle and Allison. So thank you to those great people too.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye, everybody.